Fiammetta is a 6-star artilleryman sniper featured on the Guiding Ahead event. With an ostentatiously flashy skill 3 and a deep lore, many players are incentivized to pull for her. With that in mind though, let's look at her skills, the applications of said skills, as well as how she performs relative to her competition. First off, her trait dictates that she has one of the biggest ranges in the game, which heavily impacts how a lot of players are going to use her. At maximum investment, she has significantly more attack than regular anti-air snipers, however being compensated by having nearly double the attack time. As with every 6-star, she has 2 talents, the first being pretty phenomenal, and the second being, well, usable at best. Suffering, her first talent, is very similar to Ark's health drain, however since she doesn't have any form of self-sustain in her kit, it cannot kill her. A 50% attack buff isn't anything to scoff at even if it's conditional, and in Fiammetta's case the conditional is fairly easy to satisfy, making it a defining factor of her kit. Talent 2 however is in a bit of a weird spot given that Fiammetta's skills don't benefit directly off attack speed. Given that skill 2 is a basically instantaneous burst and skill 3 is a charged infinite duration skill, the 27 plus 3 attack speed is pretty nice for helping charge them in the first place, but it's pretty mediocre for obvious reasons. Moving on to her skills though, her first skill allows her to gain an extra tile of attack range, alongside giving her plus 100% attack. Relative to skill 2 and skill 3, this skill synergizes less with her talent attack buff, given how attack scales additively. Although on paper, the low SP cost of 10 might make the skill very appealing, it isn't that great given her slow attack speed combined with the fact that she won't be hitting an enemy all the time gives it a functionally 30-30 cycle. In practice, this is just another attack up delta type skill that you'll basically never be using. So let's move on to skill 2. It fires a projectile which leaves behind mines that explode after the projectile has expired, wherein the intricacies of this skill lie in how the explosions can overlap, dealing a significant amount of single target damage on what looks at first to be an AoE wave clearing skill. This diagram drafted by CN shows the overlaps of the skill, detailing the optimal locations for the enemies to be in order for Fiammetta to nuke them effectively. If you're trying to force Fiammetta into every stage without too much thought for her exact role, this will probably be your main skill for her. Lastly, for the skill that most people know her by, the fancy long-ranged Phoenix Explosion on skill 3. Being an infinite duration skill that only requires 15 SP to charge, it has one of the lowest SP requirements for all skills in this category. Upon activation, she fixates her range to the furthest central tile and continuously bombarded with AoE attacks which have a drastically increased splash area, however dealing drastically more damage to the target in the central 5 tiles. Although the multipliers on skill 3 do seem to be a bit low, it must be taken into consideration that Fiammetta has around 1k base attack, combined with the fact that she gains 50% conditional attack with her talent, and how since skill 3's attack skill therefore it's multiplicative, skill 3 dishes out a reasonable amount of damage. I'll be ignoring skill 1 for the applications section because frankly no one uses it. First and foremost, it's important to address that Fiammetta is not a broken operator in the likes of Surda, Chowder, or even Horn. Additionally, although she's framed in the context of synergies, and her synergies aren't great, it isn't something that defines her kit and she works perfectly well in a regular squad. Fiammetta's main skill for most people, skill 2, is tailored towards dealing damage to hordes of enemies precisely around 3 tiles away from her. In this vein, she's not that dissimilar to Cutter, although her skill is far more destructive. Visually speaking, her AoE range is very deceptive and she can be placed in the middle of a 3-wide lane and hit all targets within it pretty solidly with skill 2, especially in enclosed encounter areas such as M8-8 Mephisto or SK-5. There are a lot of situations where you want the sporadic burst of damage over the consistent damage that a lot of other AoE operators bring, and in this aspect there's basically no better contender than Fiammetta. The closest example I could think of is Passenger, but Passenger has outrageously high SP cost on skill 3 and isn't that great even with Module. In theory, Fiammetta is good against enemies with larger hitboxes, but unfortunately with the exception of Big Sadlock and San Quintus Bishop, all enemies in the game have the same hitbox. Finally, skill 2 has amazing synergies with SP batteries because it's only 7 SP with the main gate towards activating it being how Fiammetta has a low attack speed and its attack recovery. The thing that ties it all together, however, is how Fiammetta loses health every second, so it makes her have amazing synergy with units such as Sarah's skill 3 or Quirkus skill 2, which generate SP upon heal. Although it does take a lot of setup and Sarah's skill 3 doesn't even boost physical damage, it's still very potent when applied correctly. There's honestly not a lot to talk about skill 2, it's a very generic but also very strong skill, and it will make Fiammetta a very solid addition to any roster. Skill 3 on the other hand is viewed as boring by a lot of Fiammetta players, but there's also a lot of people who claim that it is her main skill. Without a doubt though, it is slightly more unique than skill 2, given that although there's a lot of instances of controlled burst in the game, Fiammetta can be said to be the only unit now that offers consistent, very long-ranged AoE DPS. An interesting part about skill 3 is that its range is very deceptive. It looks like it's a 3x3 range, but actually it's the same range as Texas skill 2, which significantly opens up its applications in maps. A brief future warning for a future event stage and to be continued, but this is an example of a map that Fiammetta at first glance you can easily identify the skill 3 positioning as well as how it will be effective given the expanded splash radius. On paper, some might claim that this is a skill which doesn't have applications in a lot of maps given the supposedly constrictive range, but if you actually took Fiammetta's skill 3 range and compared it to say Rosa's base range, you'll note that their ranges are very similar and Rosa's range is rarely a hindrance to her in most maps. Weighing skill 2 and skill 3, I think Fiammetta's a very solid M6 unit. An overgeneralized recommendation from me though would be to go to skill 2 if you want to use Fiammetta in every stage as a centerpiece DPS unit, or go with skill 3 and 3 if you're more inclined with using Fiammetta as a toolkit unit, bringing her when necessary and when the stage seems to favor her range. Overall though, Fiammetta is a very solid general use unit. You don't really need to think a lot when using her and she'll provide excellent results either way. Her skill 3 can shine very well if you find a good enough placement for her in a lot of maps, and skill 2 can enable her to be a centerpiece of any roster. In addition, she's also amazing for IS2, giving the London squad an easy way to kill Big Setlock. Fiammetta in the context of her competition though is a pretty different story. Although other AoE operators like W or Chowder might seem similar to her at first glance, it's really easy to see how their kits are drastically different given that Fiammetta's entire niche is either controllable DPS with skill 2 or long range with skill 3, neither of which W or Chowder managed to provide. In fact, her main competitor is an operator not released in EN currently, Horn, whom Fiammetta directly precedes. In a pure gameplay strength context, Horn is significantly stronger than Fiammetta, given that just her skill 1 in essence is already a pseudo substitute for Fiammetta's skill 3, and her other skills, although only directly competing with Fiammetta's long range niche, is significantly stronger in a general context relative to Fiammetta's skill 2. Drawing a comparative between them does make Fiammetta seem relatively bad, however recognize that Horn is one of the top tier operators in the game, and being slightly weaker than her gameplay wise doesn't mean a whole lot. Due to how Horn completely crowds out the long range niche of her skill 3 though, I do strongly recommend for Horn over Fiammetta if you're looking for a long-ranged AoE DPS unit, so the justification for pulling Fiammetta for purely gameplay strength reasons would lie more in her skill 2 and the controlled AoE DPS that skill 2 manages to provide. There's also the argument that in a lot of maps, a far away range tower is more common than a far away melee tower that's still effective, and thus in this vein some might claim that Fiammetta still holds a long-range niche. Personally, I don't agree with that, but at the end of the day, Fiammetta's skill 3 is still a very fun skill to play around with, and Fiammetta's skill 2, which you'll probably be bringing into most stages, is unhindered by Horn's arrival, and a very fun skill to the point where you wouldn't regret pulling for her. In contrast to Goldenglow, where some players might be disappointed pulling for her, you know what you're getting with Fiammetta beforehand, a very fun, unique, and solid unit that you can bring to most maps and still have success. As always, thanks for watching, and I wish you the best in pulling for Fiammetta.